Hi guys, it is Katie Tilford, and today I'm going to be talking about the benefits of inclusion. Inclusion is a really important topic to me and a lot of other special educators because if you're in a lot of different self contained settings, sometimes your kids don't get to have those neurotypical peers, and it's really important for them to have those type of friendships. So I'm going to be talking about why inclusion is important and the benefits of inclusion today. So first we need to look at what is inclusion. So I want you to think of what your own definition of inclusion is first before continuing. So feel free to press pause and just think of what is my definition of inclusion. The Association for Supervision of and Curriculum Development defines inclusion as the practice of educating all children in the same classroom, including children with physical, mental, and developmental disabilities. Inclusion classes often require a special assistant for the classroom teacher. In a fully inclusive school or classroom, all of the children follow the same schedules. Everyone is involved in the same field trips, extracurricular activities, and assemblies. So try and think of where your classroom and where your school falls. Is everyone included in the same field trips? Do they follow the same schedules, extracurricular activities, and assemblies? Try and think about how inclusive your classroom is, and going forward, think about different things that maybe you could apply to your school or classroom. And that'll help you out when we get to the discussion questions. On this slide, you will see pictures of exclusion, segregation, integration, and inclusion, all as it relates to people with disabilities. So if you look at the inclusion section, it has, the circle around the general education classroom, but the children with disabilities are being denied the right to that education. So they don't have access to that, so they're being excluded there. If you look at the segregation section, the students with disabilities are being provided class in a separate setting. So that would be more of where I see a self-contained setting. It would be more, you're providing those services, but you're not providing them in the general education with those peers, and they're being isolated there. If you look at integration, this is where I see a lot of co-taught classrooms maybe do it, and they're not doing full inclusion. They're integrating those kids, but it's not fully inclusive. So those kids with disabilities are in the classroom with them and with their same age peers, but they're just kind of off to the side, maybe sitting in a corner and working with an LBS 1 there. If you look at the visual for inclusion, you see that the students with disabilities have been fully immersed into the classroom. They're being included, they are sitting with their peers, they're being taught with them. And that's what we're aiming for. That's what full inclusion looks like. So on this slide, I'm going to be talking about why inclusion is so important from a legal standpoint. According to the Free Appropriate Public Education Act, students with disabilities and students without disabilities must be placed in the same setting to the maximum extent appropriate to the education needs of the students with disabilities. A recipient of ED funds must place a person with a disability in the regular education environment unless it is demonstrated by the recipient that the student's needs cannot be met satisfactorily with the use of supplementary aids and services. Students with disabilities must participate with non-disabled students in both academic and non-academic services, including meals, recess, physical education, to the maximum extent appropriate to their individual needs. And again, that's brought to you by the Free Appropriate Public Education Act under Section 504. This is a continuation of why inclusion is so important. So there are social benefits for all students involved, for gen ed students, and even honestly for teachers that are unfamiliar with students with disabilities. And there's a lot of benefits for students with disabilities as well. But some of the benefits include increasing awareness of disabilities and also increasing the understanding of disabilities. For a lot of kids, they might not be familiar with what disabilities are, or they might just have those little type of thoughts about what all disabilities might be. And so it's really good for students to get to work with people who are different from them. And it also helps because it will increase their ability to collaborate effectively. Students are always going to have to work with people that are different than them, especially when they grow up. So it's a great time to get them familiar with working with students who are different from them and working on ways to work together better. And it also will help create a better sense of community and respect in your classroom. Working with people who are different than you will help students kind of gain more respect for one another, and they'll gain more flexibility in being able to work with people who are different from them. And that's a really important skill that everyone needs to take with them when they're going out and working in the real world. So I'd like for you guys to check out this website, and it has benefits of inclusive classrooms, but it also has some really great ideas and strategies that you can use. And it's a really great resource, so please check it out, and it should help you with understanding a few more things coming up in the slideshow. So this is inclusion benefits for students with disabilities. So the first thing is that it increases social skills for students, and they get a better understanding of what is socially appropriate. It helps that they're around neurotypical peers and they see their peers doing normal peer things. So, for example, I teach sixth grade, and when my students see what's normal sixth grade behavior, they kind of will model after that and take after that a little bit more than if they were more in my setting all day, where they might have a little bit harder time understanding what's socially appropriate for that age. Another benefit is it increases their self-esteem, and there's a more sense of belonging there. Just working with other people and being accepted and having that sense of acceptance when practicing inclusion really increases that self-esteem for students, and they feel more comfortable. And then another benefit for students with disabilities is it gives them a better preparation for the outside world. Students with disabilities are always going to have to work with other types of people as well, and so it really helps them get prepared and get more understanding of what it's like out in the real world. And the last benefit is that it really increases the language function that the student uses. So seeing their peers using different types of language and using it in the correct way also helps them have a better understanding of what they can say and how they can use that language to communicate with their people around them. On this slide, I have ways to practice inclusion. So I have the co-taught setting and self-contained setting, and just a few ideas that you guys can use. The first idea in the co-taught setting is to adopt a UDL mentality. UDL stands for Universal Design for Learning. And I learned about Universal Design for Learning when I was in college, and it is a really great idea that focuses on teaching to all students all at once. And so it's focusing on those needs and having built-in supports already in that lesson made to support all of your learners while also supporting those with disabilities. So it really focuses at the whole entire class and benefiting all of them with focus and supports built in. It takes a lot more planning, and it would be a lot more leveling, reading, and different things like that. But it's a really great way to practice just inclusion, and it's a great mindset to even look into. So I recommend that if you aren't familiar with UDL, you look it up and get a little bit more familiar with it, because it is really important, and there's also a discussion question about it. In the co-taught setting, another thing that you can practice is just creating an inclusive seating chart. Often I see co-taught students kind of sitting in the back working with a special education teacher or an aide, and they aren't necessarily working with those peers. And I think that there's a lot of benefits that working with peers and getting peer support can help with. And I think that the more that we do that, the more that they're getting to work with those same age peers. And the reason that we want them in that classroom is so they're getting that time with their peers. So having an inclusive seating chart is something small that you can do. Another thing that you can do is bring services and strategies into the classroom. So if you're working on chunking out words or something, maybe you bring your speech pathologist into the classroom. If you're talking about maybe some social justice things or some social issues, maybe you bring your school social worker or the counselors at your school in to have a discussion. That way you're bringing some services into your classroom as well. And it's always great to rely on those different people for different strategies, whether it's behavioral or just academic strategies that you're needing to help bring into your classroom. And then focus on strengths. A lot of times I feel like I see in co-taught settings that the kids are set to the side to focus on their weaknesses. But if you focus on their strengths, I think that it really builds up the class in general, and it's a great way just to focus on that specific student. So for example, if a student answers a question and they answer it incorrectly, it can be really hard for them to, build up courage, and that goes for any student. So if you focus on their strengths, they're more likely to consider raising their hand again and continuing to participate in that inclusive setting. Looking at the self-contained setting, something that you can do is reach out to general education teachers. I partnered with my math teacher this year, and we did some activities where my students were able to come in and do activities with them. So they ran a lemonade stand and were working with fractions and different things to make lemonade and different items. And then my students were helping look at counting money and different skills like that. So it was really great to have that partnership with her, which brings us to the next thing, which is partner with a general education class. Maybe you can go in and you can do a class with them every few weeks, or you'll do a unit with them, or just work together with them to find ways to practice inclusion. Even just play a game with them or have a little game time on Fridays for a little bit. Another thing that you can do is host a lunch group. I did this for my students, and students were allowed to bring any friend that they wanted. And so students brought friends from their gen ed classes when they went out. And a lot of my kids had not met those other students before. So it created a better sense of bonding. And then when they went out in passing period, I would see them talking and communicating with these people that normally I would never see them go up and talk to. They felt more comfortable, and it created a better sense of community between them and some other students that are out in the gen ed world. While they're in my classroom for majority of the day, they still had that group. The other thing that you can do is just really advocate for your students. It can be kind of challenging if you notice that inclusion isn't happening at your school. And so what you can continue to do is advocate for your students, advocate for what they need and what they deserve. A lot of students love getting to go out and do those fun activities, and maybe that school isn't as inclusive as their past school was, so maybe they're struggling with that. So try to advocate as much as you can for inclusion wherever you can in your school. So about the reading, if you click on the link above where it says about the reading, it will take you to the article. So my question for you is, the studies continue to show the benefits of inclusion. What are some ways your school can improve its inclusivity? So I asked you guys to think about that throughout this. So now that we're at this point, I want you guys to continue thinking about that and answer that question for me. So the study really showed that if students were included, it made a huge difference when they were social on the playground. They were more social on the playground when they were being included into the classroom. They felt more sense of community, higher self-esteem, and a better sense of belonging. And that's really great, and that's something that you want to see across the board. So what are some ways that your school could improve its inclusivity? These are your discussion questions, and I just want you guys to post them on Padlet. And so your first question is, what are some challenges or obstacles you have experienced or you worry you will experience when practicing inclusion? Inclusion can be tricky, especially if your school isn't very inclusive. So what are some challenges that you have faced before, or what are some challenges that you worry you will experience when practicing inclusion? It's hard to always know how to best advocate, and it's hard when you feel very passionate about it to use facts to advocate for that. So that's for me personally. I don't know how it is for you guys, but what are some different things that obstacles that you could see probably coming about when practicing inclusion? The next question is, how could you implement universal design for learning in your own classroom? So I want you to think and maybe look into universal design for learning if you're unfamiliar with it, and look at ways that maybe you could provide it. It does take a lot more planning and leveling, but it is really beneficial, and it does help students just in general. It helps you think about students as a whole in the class and not individual specific things. So you might have those individual specific supports, but you might have them built in for all students, so it's not specifically pointing certain students out. So I want you to look into Universal Design for Learning and kind of think about how you could implement that in your own classroom. The last question on this slide, I have my references listed. Just a few of the references that I looked at. There are some really great websites and different strategies, so feel free to check those out. During this whole COVID crisis, I had a really hard time with knowing what to do for my students. So something that I did that was really beneficial was I used Learning Ally. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Learning Ally, but it is a really great resource. My district bought a license for Learning Ally, so I'm allowed to have all of my kids with reading goals can be signed up on Learning Ally, so I'm going to talk to you about what it is. So it is a website that reads books to students, but it has books of all levels and types. I've seen kids read graphic novels, I've seen picture books, I've seen chapter books, I've seen a bunch of different types of books. And so it's really great because teaching junior high, a lot of my boys really love to read graphic novels. So it's really great if they really like a book and it's a little bit out of their level, and this website is going to read it aloud to them. So it reads it aloud to students, but at the same time, it also has the text right in front of them. And as it's being read to them, it highlights the words. So while it's reading, and if it said Learning Ally, it would highlight Learning Ally. So students are still seeing that and making that association with words and what they're hearing. Another benefit is that you can change the speed that it's reading. So I have some students that like it for it to be a little bit slower, so then they can kind of have a little bit more time to process, and they really like that. But then I also have other students that will want to speed it up a little bit because they don't like it being slow. It just depends on the student preferences. The other thing that's really great about Learning Ally is that I can monitor student involvement. So with monitoring student involvement, it tells me how many books my class has read, how many students are involved, how many books they have on their bookshelves, which tells me, what all they're reading. And it tells me what different genres we're touching and reading. And it is just a really great way to monitor the minutes being read and everything that's going on. If your students are struggling to be reading to themselves, this is a really great website that will have someone read to them. So if you click on the logo, it will take you to the website. So if you click on the Learning Ally logo, it'll take you to the website and you guys can check it out. There are a few things to watch for when you're using Learning Ally. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is students can really speed through what they're reading. So with changing that speed, they're able to go ahead and fast forward maybe a little bit, and sometimes they might miss things because they're not being very careful with it. So that's something that I talk to my students about, and I really told them, you need to leave the speed at what it is set at, or you need to slow it down a little bit. Those are the options. And so my students were all really good about that, and a lot of times they like it slower anyway. Another issue that I had was it doesn't have everything, especially older books. It has a lot more recent books. It has books on it quicker than I can get books in my library for students, so that's really great. But it doesn't have everything, and that can be kind of frustrating for students, especially when they find an older book that they liked that's a little bit out of their level. So just something to keep in mind. If you're thinking about using a book and you want to use Learning Ally, look up and make sure that it's on there first. Just a recommendation if you use Learning Ally is if you're having students answer comprehension questions, have them read the comprehension questions before they go ahead and listen to that chapter or the book. Because you can pause the reading, but I find it more helpful if students know those key words to listen and look for when they're reading. It's really helpful. And I feel like that's a skill that everyone uses, read the comprehension questions before so you know what to look for. But it's a little bit harder when you're listening to it because sometimes students' eyes may wander, so they might not look. So hearing those keywords might be really important for them. The other thing that I would make sure that I do is I would make sure that I show my students the website. It can be kind of challenging because Learning Ally also has an app that you can download to your computer. However, You cannot download books through that app. You have to log into the internet, and then you have to log in to your Learning Ally account and search for the book, add it to your bookshelf, and then you have to go back to your app and refresh it. And sometimes that can take a little bit of time, and it can just be a little bit frustrating if students don't know how to navigate it. So going over what this website looks like and what your expectations are when using the website is really important. This has all been like a super challenging time during COVID, and so I really liked Learning Ally because I could have students listen to maybe a chapter of a book and answer a few questions. And then we actually finished 2 books during this time, and my students were telling me that they were able to download other books that they liked and listen to them as well. So that was really nice because I felt like they still had access to reading materials, even though we couldn't be checking out books at school during all of this. So I hope that you guys have a great week. Thanks. That I have for you is, what are some simple ways that you could create inclusion opportunities for your students in self-contained settings using your current role at the school? So a lot of us have different roles, whether we do co-teaching or we are self-contained teachers or we're gen ed teachers. But what are some ways that you could continue to use that role that you have to create opportunities for self-contained teachers and students who are in that classroom all day and aren't getting to necessarily experience that time with those gen ed peers?